Good day, everyone. I'm Ethan, moderator for this webinar. Welcome everyone for today's webinar, Do's and Don'ts of Documenting Employee Behavior, Performance and Discipline. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Dan L.D. Dan L.D., President and founder of Advantage HR Consulting LLC, is a senior human resources professional with over 30 years of experience in the HR arena. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Ethan. And I want to thank and welcome our participants for joining us today. Today's webinar focuses on developing effective documentation with respect to our employees' performance and behavior. So let's begin. Documentation regarding an employee's performance or behavior can make or break a manager's ability to discipline, fairly terminate, promote, reward, and recognize employees. So I also want to mention documentation's role in investigations and lawsuits. So we talked about the documentation's role in investigations and lawsuits. So when we talk about evidence of the performance or the behavior, so as you're beginning the process of documentation, if you can answer the following questions, you'll be able to come up with an effective piece of documentation. So really the bottom line is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So before you can document behavior and performance, you need to first analyze what the issues are. So I've listed some guidelines in terms of when you're going through the process of analyzing the issues, what you need to keep in mind. So I want to talk now about documentation, best practices, and guidelines. So what should be happening is our managers and supervisors should be documenting issues as a routine task. So when we talk about things we should be doing when we're putting our documentation together, additionally, there are errors and pitfalls we need to be aware of when we're putting our documentation together. So now I want to get into the use of subjective terminology versus objective terminology. And I think you'll get the idea as we go through these. What I would also like to do now is give you 3 examples of documentation. The first one is what I would consider to be poor documentation. The second one I would describe as good documentation. And the third one is what I personally consider to be excellent documentation. So let's walk through these. So this first one, my example of poor documentation. So let's move on to our example of good documentation. So now let's talk about an example that I would label excellent documentation. So this next paragraph talks specifically about the impact of Joseph's behavior on the organization. You need to speak up. If you're presented with a write-up and you disagree with its content, you should say so on the spot. I also want to touch base on your formal appraisal processes. And the bottom line is that everybody needs to be involved in the process, from your senior execs to HR to managers and employees, the employee stakeholder group. They should be tracking their goal progress and then regularly communicating the goal status to their manager. We also need to be aware of some factors that could distort not only our annual performance appraisals, but also when we have those one-off conversations when issues crop up with individual employees. So when you're getting ready to sit down and discuss your employees' performance, again, whether that's a one-off situation or your annual performance review process, there are some things that can keep you on the right path when you're having these discussions. Post-discussion, obviously document that the meeting occurred. This would include obtaining the employee's signature. Sometimes the issues might be much more complicated. and therefore might require a full-blown investigation. So let's talk about that. So when we talk about effective investigations, I mentioned previously about the importance of managers providing effective feedback. So I just wanted to make a few points about that before we go on. I'm sure at some point in all of your careers, you're having a performance review discussion with your manager. So I just want to give you a few tips for providing effective feedback. So your feedback needs to be specific, timely, and frequent for it to be effective. So now you're at the point where you're ready to take corrective action where it's necessary. So all employees are expected to meet performance standards and behave appropriately in the workplace. So the goal of corrective action is to guide the employee to correct their performance or behavior by identifying the problems, the causes and solutions, not to punish the employee. And there is a whole host of reactions you might receive when you are disciplining an employee. So when you're ready to impose discipline, there are some things you can do to minimize the likelihood of being on the wrong end of a lawsuit. So if all your efforts have failed, your employees continuing the bad behavior or the poor performance, you're probably at the point where you need to consider terminating the employee. Before you terminate, you need to assess the risks of taking termination action versus the risks of not taking termination action. First thing you need to look to see is this employee we're considering terminating in a protected category status? Final actions. Again, this termination should not come as a surprise to that employee if the manager has done his or her job all the way up to the point of termination. When you're ready to give the bad news, plan the timing of the termination. So your termination discussions, here's just a simple timeline you can follow. So before we get to Q&A, just want to mention a few things in closing. To accurately evaluate your employees and then be able to defend those evaluations if necessary. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to Ethan for any questions our participants might have.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. That was a wonderful webinar.
Thank you. I again want to thank our participants for joining us today. I hope you found the presentation to be informative and helpful.
Thank you, Dan. That does conclude the session for today. You may all disconnect now. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.